Hey everyone and welcome back. We're diving into a topic today that you specifically requested, and it's a pretty fascinating one. We're going to be exploring the connection between the brain and the ovarian cycle.
Yeah, it really is a complex system, but we're going to break it all down, hopefully make it understandable, and you might even learn a thing or two along the way.
Exactly. So did you know that scientists over 100 years ago were already thinking about how the brain controls the reproductive system?
Oh yeah, definitely. There were some really groundbreaking studies even back then.
And get this, we'll even talk about some research from the 70s that was called sniffing your way to pregnancy.
Yeah, that was a really interesting study.
It sounds crazy, right? So yeah, we're going to dive into all of that today.
It's amazing to think that something like our menstrual cycle, which we just kind of take for granted, is actually controlled by this really complicated communication system between the brain and the ovaries. It really is mind-blowing. So let's start by going all the way back to the early 1900s. That's where the story begins, with scientists starting to figure out how the brain influences the reproductive system.
Back then, researchers were making some really big discoveries, even without all the fancy technology we have today. Two scientists, Crow and Ashner, were some of the first to show that the pituitary gland, that tiny gland in the brain, is connected to how the reproductive organs function.
Okay, so the pituitary gland, got it. What did they find?
Well, they found that when they removed parts of the pituitary gland, it caused problems with the reproductive organs. They even suggested that you could use extracts from the pituitary to treat reproductive issues.
Wow, that's pretty amazing for the early 1900s. But how did they even know to look at the pituitary gland in the first place?
Well, around the same time, there were these two other scientists, Smith and Zondek, who were working on something called the gonadotrophic principle. Basically the idea that the pituitary gland is controlling the ovaries somehow.
Okay, so they knew the pituitary was involved, but they didn't know how it was communicating with the ovaries.
Right. So what they discovered was pretty groundbreaking. The pituitary actually releases hormones that travel to the ovaries and basically tell them what to do. It's like the pituitary is sending little instructions to the ovaries.
Okay, so we're starting to understand how they communicate. But did they know which hormones were involved?
Yeah. So this is where Zondek's work is really impressive. He said that there were actually TWO, pituitary hormones, that controlled how the ovaries work. And guess what? He was totally right.
Wow, that's amazing. So what are those two hormones?
Those two hormones are what we now call follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH.
Okay, FSH and LH, got it. So thanks to Zondek, we now know that these two hormones are essential players in the ovarian cycle. But this is where I get a little confused. If the pituitary is the one releasing FSH and LH, how does the brain tell the pituitary what to do? There must be another part of the brain that's in control, right?
Yeah, you're totally right. The hypothalamus, which is another part of the brain, is like the control center. Think of it like the hypothalamus is the CEO making the big decisions, and the pituitary is like the manager carrying out those decisions.
Okay, I like that analogy. The hypothalamus is the boss. But how does the hypothalamus actually talk to the pituitary gland? It's not like they're sending emails back and forth, right?
Well, they have a really special and direct way of communicating. It's called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system.
What?
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But basically, it's like a dedicated hotline between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. It lets the hypothalamus send really specific instructions to the pituitary using something called releasing hormones.
Okay, so it's like a secret code. So the hypothalamus sends coded messages through this hotline telling the pituitary exactly which hormones to release and when.
Exactly. And one of the most important messages it sends is a hormone called gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH for short. This is the key signal that tells the pituitary to release those two hormones we talked about, FSH and LH.
Okay, so we've got GnRH. It's like a chain of command. The hypothalamus releases GnRH, which tells the pituitary to release FSH and LH, which then go and act on the ovaries.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating how this all works together, but I have a question. There's got to be more to it than that, right? The menstrual cycle is timed so precisely, with hormone levels going up and down throughout the month. How does the brain actually control the timing and the levels of all these hormones? It's not just a constant flow, is it?
That's a great question. And you're right. It's not just a constant flow of hormones. It's more like a dance with very specific steps. And the key to this dance is actually the pulsatile nature of GnRH release.
Pulsatile, what does that mean?
It means that GnRH is released in little bursts or pulses. It's not a steady stream. And these pulses are carefully timed. That's what makes the whole cycle work.
So it's not just the amount of GnRH that matters, but also the timing of its release.
Exactly. In 1980, a scientist named Nobel figured out that if you just give GnRH continuously, it actually stops the pituitary from releasing those other hormones. It only works when GnRH is released in pulses, just like it happens naturally in the brain.
Wow, so giving a constant dose of GnRH actually backfires. That's crazy. It's like the brain is speaking in a very specific language using these pulses, and if you mess up the rhythm, the ovaries don't understand the message.
That's a perfect way to put it. And there's even more to it. Research by Wild in the same year, 1980, showed that different pulse frequencies of GnRH can actually make the pituitary release either more FSH or more LH.
Wait, so you're telling me the brain can choose which hormone gets released just by changing the speed of the GnRH pulses? That's incredible.
It is. Slow pulses tend to make the pituitary release more FSH, while faster pulses favor LH release. And this is how the cycle moves through its different phases.
That's so cool. It's like the brain is conducting an orchestra of hormones using the tempo of the GnRH pulses to bring out different instruments at different times. But this is what I don't get. If these GnRH pulses are so important, what's actually controlling the pulsing itself? There has to be something else in the brain that's in charge of that, right?
You're exactly right. It's like a puzzle within a puzzle. And the answer is a special group of neurons in the hypothalamus called KND neurons. They're the ones that control the GnRH pulses.
KNDI neurons. Okay. What makes them so special?
Well, first of all, KNDI stands for kisspeptin, neurokinin B, and dynorphin. These are the neurotransmitters that these neurons produce.
Okay, so lots of big words. What do those neurotransmitters actually do?
Basically, they're the messengers that allow the KND neurons to control the release of GnRH.
Okay, so we've added another layer to our chain of command. KNDI neurons control GnRH, which controls FSH and LH, which act on the ovaries. But how do these KNDI neurons know when to fire off those GnRH pulses?
That's where something called feedback loops come in. KNDI neurons are super sensitive to the levels of estrogen in the body. They basically act as little sensors, constantly monitoring estrogen and then adjusting how often and how strong the GnRH pulses are.
So it's like a constant conversation between the brain and the ovaries. The ovaries make estrogen, the KNDI neurons sense it, and then they tweak the GnRH pulses to make the pituitary release the right amount of FSH and LH. It's amazing how this is all so finely tuned.
It really is. And it gets even more complicated when we look at how all of this actually controls each stage of the menstrual cycle.
Okay, I think I'm ready to see how this all works in the actual cycle. So let's break down what happens in each phase, starting with the early follicular phase.
All right, so right after menstruation ends, estrogen and progesterone levels are really low. It's like hitting the reset button.
So what happens when the hormone levels are low? Does that signal the brain to do something?
You got it. Those low levels of estrogen and progesterone trigger the KNDI neurons. Remember, they're the ones controlling the GnRH pulses. And the message is clear. It's time to start a new cycle.
So what do those KNDI neurons do? Do they start firing off GnRH pulses like crazy?
Well, they do something pretty interesting. They increase the strength of the GnRH pulses, but they actually slow down how often the pulses happen. And remember, slower GnRH pulses favor the release of FSH.
Ah, I see. That's why FSH levels increase in the early follicular phase. It's all about getting those ovaries ready to start growing new follicles.
Exactly. FSH stimulates the growth of multiple follicles in the ovaries. Each follicle has an immature egg inside. It's kind of like a race has started, and many follicles are trying to mature.
So the race is on. Many follicles are competing to be the one that releases the egg, but how does one follicle end up winning the race?
Well, as we move into the mid-follicular phase, things get a little more complex. As the follicles grow, they start making more and more estrogen. And remember how we said those KNDI neurons are sensitive to estrogen levels? Well, as estrogen levels rise, it actually starts to inhibit some of those KNDI neurons.
Wait, so more estrogen actually slows down some of the KNDI neurons? That seems kind of counterintuitive. Shouldn't more estrogen mean more activity?
It might seem that way, but it's actually a really clever feedback mechanism. By slowing down some KNDI neurons, the strength of those GnRH pulses decreases. At the same time, the pulses actually start to happen more frequently. And what happens when the GnRH pulses speed up?
We get more LH. So now the brain is shifting gears, favoring LH release. But what about FSH? Doesn't it need to stay high to keep those follicles growing?
You're right to be thinking about FSH. As LH levels rise, FSH levels actually start to decline during the mid-follicular phase. There's a couple of reasons for this. First, those faster GnRH pulses are basically telling the pituitary to focus on LH production instead of FSH. And second, Those growing follicles themselves start producing a hormone called inhibin, which specifically tells the pituitary to stop making FSH.
Wow, so it's like a double whammy for FSH. The brain is dialing it back and the ovaries are putting on the brakes. But why is it so important for FSH levels to drop?
That's a great question. It turns out that this drop in FSH is really important for selecting the dominant follicle. The follicle that has the most receptors for FSH, meaning it's the most sensitive to FSH, will be able to keep growing even when there's less FSH around. The other follicles, which aren't as sensitive, will start to fade away.
It's like survival of the fittest for those follicles.
Yeah.
The one that can grab onto FSH the best is the one that gets to keep growing.
Exactly. And all of this is happening while LH levels are steadily rising thanks to those faster GnRH pulses. That increase in LH is what gets the dominant follicle ready for ovulation.
Okay, so now we're building up to the main event. What happens in the late follicular phase, right before ovulation?
So remember those high levels of estrogen being produced by the dominant follicle? Well, they activate another set of kisspeptin neurons in a different part of the brain called the AVPV.
Hold on, are you saying there are different types of kisspeptin neurons that respond differently to estrogen?
Yes, there are different types of kisspeptin neurons with different functions.
That's fascinating. So what do these AVPV neurons do?
These AVPV neurons are the ones that trigger the LH surge. They basically tell the hypothalamus to release a huge amount of GnRH really quickly, and that causes the pituitary to release a big surge of LH.
Wow, so it's like a chain reaction. Estrogen activates these AVPV neurons, which tell the hypothalamus to release a ton of GnRH, which then causes a surge of LH. And that LH surge is what finally triggers ovulation.
Exactly. It's this amazing cascade of events that's perfectly timed and orchestrated by the brain in response to rising estrogen levels.
So the egg is released, and hopefully it meets a sperm. What's happening hormonally at this point? What's going on in the luteal phase?
Now we're in the luteal phase, which is all about preparing for possible pregnancy. The ruptured follicle changes into what's called the corpus luteum.
The corpus luteum. Yeah, I've heard of that. It's the one that makes progesterone, right? The hormone that helps the lining of the uterus get ready for implantation. But how does the brain know to shift gears and start focusing on progesterone production?
It all comes back to those feedback loops. Estrogen and progesterone from the corpus luteum tell those Canidae neurons to slow down GnRH release.
So it's like the corpus luteum is saying to the brain, hey, we got this. No need to work so hard right now.
Exactly. This decrease in GnRH means that LH and FSH levels also decrease. This basically prevents any more follicles from developing.
So it's a big hormonal shift after ovulation. The body is putting all its energy into supporting the corpus luteum and getting ready for a possible pregnancy.
Exactly. And if fertilization doesn't happen, the corpus luteum eventually breaks down, those hormone levels drop, and the whole cycle starts all over again.
It really is a carefully choreographed dance. The brain and the ovaries are in constant communication through hormones and feedback loops.
It is. And we shouldn't forget that the ovaries themselves are active participants in this whole process. They're not just passively following orders from the brain.
Right. Earlier, you mentioned that there are factors within the ovaries that also help to fine-tune the cycle. Can you give us some examples?
Of course. The granulosa cells in the ovaries, the cells surrounding the developing egg, actually have receptors for kisspeptin and neurokinin B, which are key parts of those KNDI neurons we talked about. This means that the cells in the ovaries are directly responding to signals from the brain.
So it's not just a one-way street. The ovaries are talking back to the brain, too.
Exactly. It's a two-way conversation. There's even research suggesting that kisspeptin might actually be produced in the ovaries themselves, and it might help protect follicles from dying off early on in their development.
Wow, so kisspeptin is multi-talented. It's not just a messenger from the brain. It might have a role in the ovaries themselves. This is amazing.
It is. And then we have other factors like activin and inhibin, which are made in the ovaries. They help regulate the levels of FSH.
Wow, so many different pieces working together. It seems like the brain is in charge, but the ovaries are definitely making sure everything runs smoothly.
It really is a team effort.
Huh?
And it really highlights how complex and interconnected the female reproductive system is.
This brings up a question for me. You know, if the system is so intricate and delicate, what happens when things go wrong? So many people struggle with reproductive issues, and I can see how even small disruptions in these hormonal signals could cause big problems.
That's such an important point. Understanding how the brain controls the ovarian cycle is crucial for figuring out why things go wrong, like in conditions like PCOS or endometriosis, and even infertility. If we know how it's supposed to work, we're in a much better position to figure out what might be happening when it doesn't work.
That makes sense. So, for example, we mentioned PCOS earlier. What's the connection between this intricate system and PCOS?
PCOS, or polycystic ovary syndrome, is a hormonal disorder that affects a lot of women. It's characterized by irregular periods, higher levels of androgens, those are typically thought of as male hormones, and often cysts on the ovaries.
Right. It's a really common condition, but I feel like doctors don't always know what causes it.
That's true. The exact causes are still being studied. But research suggests that problems with the brain's control of the ovarian cycle might play a big role in PCOS. For instance, some studies show that women with PCOS might have changes in how active those KNDI neurons are, which could lead to abnormal GnRH pulses.
So it's like the system that's supposed to regulate the cycle is going haywire.
Yeah, exactly. And when those GnRH pulses are messed up, it can cause hormonal imbalances like having too much LH. And that can cause more problems with follicle development and ovulation. It's like a domino effect. A problem in the brain can lead to all these other hormonal problems.
But if we know that's happening, could that help us develop better treatments?
Yeah, definitely. If we can figure out exactly how the brain's control system is disrupted in PCOS, it could lead to new treatments that target the root of the problem. For example, scientists are looking at ways to change KNDI neuron activity or directly influence those GnRH pulses to try and get things back on track.
That's amazing. It sounds like all this complex research could actually lead to real solutions for people with PCOS. It really shows how everything is connected.
It does. And it highlights how important it is to keep researching these systems. We still have a lot to learn, but every new discovery gets us closer to understanding and hopefully treating these conditions.
This has been so eye-opening. We started with those early pioneers of endocrinology, and now we're talking about the intricacies of the brain, the ovaries, and how they all work together. It's amazing how complex the female reproductive system really is.
It truly is. And we've only just scratched the surface.
Speaking of discoveries, you mentioned a study that caught your eye. It involves something called intranasal administration of GnRH. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, that study was really interesting. It was actually done back in the 1970s, shortly after Shalley's work on isolating GnRH. Researchers wanted to see what they could do with this new hormone, and they came up with a pretty unique way to give it to people.
Intranasal administration, that just means sniffing it, right? Are you telling me they had people sniff GnRH?
Well, it does sound unusual, but it's actually a real way to give some medications. The idea is that if you give GnRH through the nose, it can bypass the liver and go straight into the bloodstream.
It's like a shortcut to the pituitary gland. But why would you want to give people GnRH this way? What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, this study focused on women with something called hypopituitary hypogonadism. It's a condition where the pituitary gland doesn't produce enough FSH and LH. This can lead to problems with ovulation and menstruation. They thought that by giving these women GnRH through the nose, they could basically kickstart their pituitary glands and get their ovaries working again.
Oh, I see. So they were trying to mimic the natural pulses of GnRH, but bypassing the brain entirely.
Precisely. And you know what? The results were pretty incredible. The researchers found that this sniffing your way to pregnancy approach actually worked. They were able to induce ovulation in these women, and some of them even got pregnant.
Wow, that's amazing. So something as simple as sniffing GnRH could help people overcome infertility.
It was a groundbreaking discovery, and it really opened up new possibilities for treating reproductive disorders. And it just goes to show how powerful it can be to understand these basic mechanisms of the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis.
This whole deep dive has been incredible. We started with the pioneers of reproductive endocrinology, and now we're talking about sniffing hormones to get pregnant. It's mind-blowing how much progress has been made.
It is, and there's still so much more to discover.
I'm ready for more. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a break and come back to explore even more about the fascinating world of the neurocontrol of the ovarian cycle. Welcome back, everyone. We're picking up right where we left off, talking about that groundbreaking research on intranasal GnRH. It's amazing how those early scientists were so innovative.
It really is inspiring, isn't it? They were pushing the boundaries of what was possible and opening up whole new avenues for research.
And their work has paved the way for so much of what we understand about the neurocontrol of the ovarian cycle today. We've come a long way since those early days of sniffing hormones.
We definitely have. But those early studies were crucial for figuring out the basics of how this whole system works.
Absolutely. So before the break, we were talking about how those GnRH pulses, controlled by the KNDI neurons, orchestrate the different phases of the ovarian cycle. I'm ready to see how this all plays out in action. Let's break it down phase by phase.
Okay, great. We left off at the luteal phase, right? Remember, that's the phase after ovulation when the corpus luteum is formed and starts producing progesterone.
Yeah, that's right. The corpus luteum is like the star of the luteal phase. It's responsible for getting the uterine lining ready for a possible pregnancy.
Exactly. Progesterone is essential for thickening the uterine lining and making it a hospitable environment for a fertilized egg to implant.
But what happens if pregnancy doesn't occur? What happens to the corpus luteum and those hormone levels?
Well, if there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum doesn't get the signal to stick around. It starts to break down, which causes those estrogen and progesterone levels to drop. And remember how we talked about those KNDI neurons being sensitive to hormone levels? Well, those declining hormone levels send the signal back to the KNDI neurons in the hypothalamus.
It's like the corpus luteum is saying, mission not accomplished, time to start over.
That's a great way to put it. And the KNDI neurons get the message loud and clear. They start to increase the frequency of those GnRH pulses again, and the whole cycle begins anew.
It's amazing how everything comes full circle. Those low hormone levels trigger the KNDI neurons to start firing off those GnRH pulses again, which sets the stage for a new cycle of follicle development, ovulation, and the formation of a new corpus luteum. It's a never-ending loop.
It really is. And that loop is essential for maintaining reproductive health and allowing for the possibility of pregnancy.
You know, it's fascinating to think about all the factors that can influence this delicate dance of hormones. We've talked about the brain, the ovaries, and the intricate feedback loops between them. But I'm curious, what about external factors? Can things like stress or diet actually affect the neurocontrol of the ovarian cycle?
That's a great question, and it's an area of active research. We know that the brain and the reproductive system are constantly communicating with each other, and external factors can definitely play a role in that communication.
So it's not just about what's happening inside the body. What's going on outside the body can matter too.
Exactly. For example, stress can trigger the release of hormones like cortisol, which can interfere with the normal functioning of the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis.
So chronic stress could actually throw off the whole cycle.
It definitely could. And there's also evidence that nutritional deficiencies or extreme dieting can disrupt hormone production and signaling, potentially leading to irregular cycles or even amenorrhea, which is the absence of menstruation.
Wow, it's really a holistic system. Everything is connected. It makes you realize how important it is to take care of your overall health and well-being for optimal reproductive function.
Absolutely. Taking care of your mental and physical health is crucial for maintaining a healthy balance of hormones and supporting the intricate communication between your brain and your reproductive system.
This has been such an incredible journey of discovery. We've gone from the early pioneers of endocrinology to the intricate dance of hormones and feedback loops, and we've even touched on the potential impacts of external factors like stress and diet. It's truly amazing how much we've learned about this complex system.
It really is remarkable, and the more we learn, the better equipped we are to understand and address reproductive health issues.
I couldn't agree more. But before we wrap up this fascinating deep dive, I have one more question for you. We've talked a lot about the science, but I'm curious about your personal perspective as an expert in this field. What do you find most awe-inspiring about the neurocontrol of the ovarian cycle? What keeps you fascinated by this topic?
That's a wonderful question. For me, the most awe-inspiring aspect is the sheer elegance and efficiency of this system. It's a testament to the power of evolution and the incredible interconnectedness of our bodies. Think about it. We have this tiny group of neurons in the brain, the KNDI neurons, that are constantly monitoring hormone levels and sending out these precisely timed signals, these GnRH pulses that orchestrate a whole cascade of events in the ovaries, leading to the development and release of an egg. And all of this happens without us even having to think about it.
It really is mind-blowing. It's like a symphony playing out inside our bodies, and we're usually completely unaware of the conductor in the orchestra.
Precisely. And the more we understand about this symphony, the more we appreciate the beauty and complexity of the female reproductive system. It's a system that deserves our respect, our curiosity, and our continued exploration.
Well said. To our listener who requested this deep dive, thank you for inspiring this incredible journey of discovery. We've explored the intricate world of the neurocontrol of the ovarian cycle, from the early pioneers to the latest research. It's a topic that deserves even more attention in research, and we're excited to see what new insights emerge in the years to come. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive as much as we have. Keep learning, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep. It's amazing to think that something as fundamental as our menstrual cycle is controlled by this incredibly sophisticated system in our brains. It's like a hidden world that we're only just beginning to understand.
It really is. And the more we learn about it, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
You know, this whole conversation has made me wonder, if this system is so intricate and finely tuned, what are the implications for reproductive health? I mean, we know so many people experience issues like irregular periods or infertility. Could problems with this neurocontrol system be a factor?
Absolutely. That's one of the most exciting aspects of this research. Its potential to help us understand and treat reproductive disorders. For example, we talked about PCOS earlier, but there's so many other conditions that could be linked to disruptions in the neurocontrol of the ovarian cycle.
So, like what? What other conditions could be affected?
Well, endometriosis is a big one. It's a painful condition where tissue, similar to the lining of the uterus, grows outside the uterus. And there's growing evidence that alterations in the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis might contribute to the development of endometriosis.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about hormones, it's about how the brain is controlling those hormones that could be a key factor in endometriosis.
Exactly. And then there's premature ovarian insufficiency, where the ovaries stop working properly before the age of 40. Again, disruptions in the communication between the brain and the ovaries are thought to play a role in this condition.
It's incredible to think that by understanding these brain signals, we might be able to develop new treatments for all sorts of reproductive health issues.
It really is a promising area of research, and it highlights the importance of taking a holistic approach to reproductive health. We need to consider not just the ovaries, but also the brain and how it's orchestrating the whole system.
Well said. I think our listener who requested this deep dive would be thrilled to hear all of this. We've covered so much ground today, from those early discoveries about the pituitary gland to the intricate workings of KNDI neurons and GnRH pulses. And we've even explored some of the potential implications for reproductive health. It's been an incredible journey.
It really has. And it just goes to show how much there is still to learn about this amazing system. But every new discovery brings us closer to understanding the complexities of the female body and finding new ways to support women's health.
I couldn't agree more. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the neurocontrol of the ovarian cycle. We hope you found this exploration as fascinating as we did. A huge thank you to our listener for suggesting this topic. And to everyone listening, keep those questions coming, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.